Deposed and defiant in Egypt, Mohamed Morsi refuses to recognize the court on the first day of his trial. Some opponents of the current government insist the trial is an excuse to crush the Muslim Brotherhood. Just what is the legal basis for prosecuting Egypt's first democratically elected president? And will his trial worsen an already tense political situation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abu Ghaida. The deposed president goes on trial in Egypt. Mohamed Morsi is accused of inciting murder and violence, and along with 14 other senior members of the Muslim Brotherhood stood trial on Monday. But Morsi refused to recognize the court and insisted he's still the president of Egypt. Well, the case has now been adjourned until January the 8th. Morsi was flown to Burj Al Arab prison in Alexandria, where he will be held until his trial resumes. Well, he faces a number of charges. Let's take a closer look at them. The trial on Monday dealt specifically with the deaths of 3 people during street fights in December last year outside the presidential palace. And another charge that was not addressed on Monday was an accusation that Morsi conspired with the Palestinian group Hamas. He's accused of giving them information about the security situation during the Egyptian revolution and helping some Hamas members escape from Egyptian prisons. While Morsi is also being investigated for insulting judges during his time as president, accusing them of rigging elections during Hosni Mubarak's presidency. Well, Mohamed Morsi has come a long way from jailed Brotherhood member to the presidential palace and now possibly facing the death penalty. Morsi rose through the ranks of the Brotherhood before becoming a member of the powerful Guidance Bureau in 1995. He was briefly jailed and then he escaped during the 2011 revolution. The Brotherhood eventually decided to put forward a candidate for the presidential election. Morsi wasn't the first choice, leading some to describe him as a, quote, spare tire candidate. But he overcame the odds and he did become Egypt's first civilian president. He was in power for almost exactly 1 year. And in that time, he wrestled for power from the military, but angered people for what was seen as overstepping his mandate. In June, that discontent led to mass protests. And on July the 3rd, the military removed Morsi from power, and he's been held ever since. Let's bring in our guests for this Inside Story. In London, we have with us Abdullah El-Haddad. He's a spokesman of the Muslim Brotherhood press office. Over in Berlin, Sarah Eltantawi. She's a fellow at the Forum Trans-Rejional Studien at the Vishen Shafts Kolleg. And here in Doha, Abdullah Al Arian. He's an assistant professor of history at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Welcome to all of you to Inside Story. Abdullah Al Arian, Morsi's trial, as we've been reporting, has now been adjourned to January the 8th. Did you expect it to take this route?
Well, I think we didn't know exactly what to expect. The only thing we knew really to expect, I think, is the fact that this wasn't going to be a legitimate trial in the sense of there being, actual accusations and charges reflective of the actions taken by Mohamed Morsi, and that there would be evidence presented in a systematic way, the way that you would normally see a legal proceeding carried out. I think we expected this to really be a very highly politicized, highly charged trial, highly charged proceeding, and I think that's exactly what we got. We saw, of course, that the military government currently has been trying as much as possible to milk this for as much political currency as it could to try to kind of crush the spirit of the opposition to the military coup within Egypt, and at the same time to try to enact a sort of legal defeat against the Muslim Brotherhood and its leadership, and also
right. You know what? We're going to talk about the broader implications just a little later, but I want to focus on exactly what we saw in the courtroom on Monday. Let me ask you about the trial not being broadcast. Why do you think that is? Because if you look at past trials of Hosni Mubarak, they were.
Well, I think because there's an attempt to control the message, and we've seen this on the part of the regime that's been in power since the July 3rd coup, the fact that they're trying as much as possible to really manage the type of message that's getting out. It's a government that's still in danger of not being legitimized by a significant number of Egyptians that are opposed to the coup government and to the idea that you would overthrow a democratically elected president regardless of his performance in office. And of course, in this attempt to try and control the message, the they're very nervous about what his actual performance or his appearance in court might look like to a number of Egyptians and perhaps even to the rest of the world. And we've seen, of course, through his displays, his defiance, his holding up of the Rabah sign, his declaration that he's still the president, his talking back to the judges that are presiding over this proceeding, that all of those things are actually considered, I think, a propaganda victory for the Muslim Brotherhood and for those people who continue to support Morsi's claim to the presidency.
Well, let's put that, in fact, to the Muslim Brotherhood and speak to Abdullah Al-Haddad from London. I mean, is this a propaganda victory, Abdullah Al-Haddad? And why, what do you make of the defiance of Morsi in the proceedings today?
Well, of course, this is a propaganda victory. Today we have seen the first democratically elected president in Egypt on trial. We have seen democracy on trial. We have seen the will of the people on trial. We have seen the 25th of January revolution on trial. Today, Abdel Fattah Sisi and the military junta are sending a clear message to the Egyptian people. We will not respect your vote. We will put your vote on trial. They are destroying all hopes of democracy in Egypt. They are driving Egypt into a dark tunnel. And Morsi stood today and said to the judge, I am the legitimate president and I shouldn't be tried in this court. And he was right about this, and he didn't stood up for himself. He stood up for the will of the people, because Article 152 from the Constitution that were voted by the people said if there is a charge against the president of Egypt, then there should be a motion signed based on a charge should be based on a motion signed by 1/3 members of the House of Representatives, and there should be a special court for that, headed by the President Constitutional Supreme Court and other special judges, and the prosecution should be carried out by the general prosecutor. So it's clear that this is illegitimate judge. It's clear that we have seen today that one of the judges is actually the one who dropped Ahmed Shafiq, the Mubarak right hand case, and now he is doing it from he's a Morsi case.
Right, okay, Abdullah Al-Haddad, you speak about, okay, hang on a second, you talk about Morsi standing up for himself, but I want to ask you about what you know about his defense team, because from what we understand, the lawyers have not had any access to him, but it's not clear if that's because Morsi himself has refused to meet with them or they haven't been allowed access.
That's right.
Can you just clarify that?
No. Morsi refused to have lawyers because this is an illegitimate court. But the others they had lawyers, and there were 24 lawyers. The junta judges rejected their request to enter the court. There were only 4.
Sarah, over to you in Berlin. What do you make of what the gentlemen are saying, and how has this process appeared to you?
Well, for one thing, to pick up on something that the last speaker said, he referenced the constitutional means of ousting the president, but did not mention, of course, that there is no parliament, or was no parliament, and is no parliament in Egypt for there to be a 2/3 vote to happen. So the June 30 mass popular revolt was an expression of public will. There's no question about it. We can call it different names, but the problem with the Muslim Brotherhood zero-sum strategy, which we saw once again on display today, is that it doesn't work, and it doesn't take into account the chain of events that were set off on June 30th that have led us to the point that we are now. My position on what we're seeing now is that the charges that are brought against Morsi are valid. There were shootings at Ittihadiyya. He did, in fact, order his supporters to shoot legitimate protesters. But the context in which, here I would somewhat agree with my co-panelists, that the context in which all of this is happening is deeply compromised for a couple of different reasons, probably different reasons than maybe they would put forward. I think that if you are going to charge Morsi with the killing of protesters at Ittihadiyya, again, I think those are valid charges. The issue I see there is that the military regime, which itself killed protesters at Maspero, and in fact pro-Morsi protesters, of course, in Rabah, themselves are still not held accountable for those crimes. So that's where I see the compromise. But the actual charges, as far as Ittihadiyya, I think are valid. I think actually the charges which we did not hear about today, which are charges of collaboration with Hamas, are actually more serious, and we will probably see that in January. The issue there is, it was their communication with Hamas in contradistinction to the national security interests of Egypt. There is a minimum requirement of the president of any country that president act in good faith to secure the national security and the public good of that nation. And if Morsi acted counter to that and counter to the recommendations of the military and military intelligence to pursue an agenda that is not deemed to be in the Egyptian national interest, which is namely to collaborate with transnational groups that have a totally different agenda from what is deemed to be in the best interest of Egypt, then there we have a problem, and there we have
a
real, that to me is the more important issue.
Right.
That's the much more important issue.
Abdullah Al-Haddad, I will allow you to respond, please.
Well, of course, the problem that she acknowledged the will of the people and in the 30th of June, but she didn't acknowledge the will of the people for the last 4 months. We have seen millions of people marching the street for the last month. We have political differences all the time, and we will still having these political differences. But it's not a decision for Abdel Fattah al-Sisi or anyone else to take the decision to choose a side between on another side. It is the decision of the ballot box, is the decision of the democratical process. That's what we should acknowledge. That's what should we respect. This is the principles that we fought for it when we, in the 25th of January revolution against the Mubarak regime. Now we have seen this deep state of Mubarak regime is coming back. The second point is not for us to charge Morsi for this kind of things. As I said, there will be a parliamentary election in the next 2 months, as Morsi said in his initiative that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took. And this House of the Representative, he should charge Morsi whatever he thinks that he had to do. So that's the whole point. This is the democratical process. If we can't respect this democratical process, there will be no principle of freedom and justice in Egypt. And now we are seeing the deep state of Mubarak regime is coming back. Now we have seen all the old faces is coming back. Now we have seen thousands of people are being killed on the street, being murdered or tortured. 3 days ago, 22 female anti-coup students, minors, half of them are minors. They were just arrested only because they raised Rab'a sign while they were protesting. This is not the Egypt that we dreamt about. This is not the Egypt that we sacrificed for it.
All right,
we have to continue on.
All right, Sarah does want to respond, and then Abdullah Al Arian, I will be coming to you in just a moment and asking you about the old faces that Abdullah Al-Haddad was just referring to. But Sarah, go ahead.
Well, I think that what we see now from the pro-Morsi side of this debate is an over-focus on the structure of what they're calling democracy as opposed to the actual substance of what has happened in Egypt. There's no question that what happened in Egypt on June 30th and July 3rd and beyond is extremely complicated, and I believe that we need to keep alive the nuance of what happened in Egypt and refrain from using kind of rhetorical talking points to discuss what's happened in Egypt. The previous panelists talked about the democratic process, but the fact of the matter is, in November of 2012, when President Morsi declared himself above judicial review and pushed through a very unpopular constitution, that was the moment for many Egyptians that his democratic legitimacy ended or was severely compromised. And that is the moment, excuse me, I'm still speaking. That was the moment, excuse me, that was the moment in which, excuse me, that is the moment in which that led up, thank you, that led to a chain reaction that led to mass popular revolts. He speaks of the will of the people, but he's trying to say that what he calls the anti-coup protesters are somehow the only people in Egypt. It's not true. It's not empirically true. The majority of the Egyptian people do not want President Morsi's governance back. This is not. Well,
no one should speak for the majority of the Egyptian people. It's only the ballot box.
This is.
No,
it's not only the ballot box, as we have seen. This is not my opinion.
This is not your decision, neither
if you're
my
trying
decision.
to claim that
It's
the
decision
majority
ballot
of the
box.
Egyptian people support Morsi, you are not operating in reality. I am operating in reality. The reality of the situation in Egypt is that the majority of the people do not want President Morsi as their president. They went out into the streets
This is
in
not
the
your
millions
decision.
on
This
June
is the decision
30th
of
to
the ballot
protest
box.
this government. You're right, it's not my decision. I am apprehending reality. Unlike the pro-Morsi camp. And I would appeal to the pro-Morsi camp to understand that what has happened was a major indictment on this president.
Clearly, there are two different viewpoints.
Sir, but if you
allow me to just
if you don't understand that President Sisi is very popular, I don't know what reality you're in.
Allow me to just get in here and bring in Abdullah El Arian and just bring it back to the focus of the proceedings, Abdullah, that we saw. Because if you compare what we saw on Monday with Morsi's proceedings to, for example, the former president Hosni Mubarak, he was tried along with his interior minister Habib Al-Adli. Where was Morsi's interior minister in this trial, in the proceedings?
Well, I think Morsi's interior minister continues to be the interior minister, and I think this speaks volumes about the nature of this supposed revolution that Egypt experienced in 2011 and the promises of it, which of course were never fulfilled. And I think this speaks to a larger question of the fact that this regime has never truly been replaced. That just because you rid yourself of the dictator, the head of this dictatorship, doesn't mean that you've actually been able to expunge the entire regime from power. And I think the Morsi presidency should be examined within that light, that all of those abuses that happened, many of them happened really at the hands of the security services and agencies that he was not in control of. And I think the best evidence of that is the fact that the interior minister and the defense minister, both of whom continue to be in their positions, were both under the Morsi regime clearly acting very much independently and without really following any kind of direction. Now, one could fault Morsi perhaps for giving the impression that he was somehow in command of these critical state institutions at a time when he was not. But I don't think we've seen any direct evidence, at least with regards to his direct involvement in any killing of protesters. And even if we were to talk specifically about the events at Ittihadiyya last year, we know that there were more Muslim Brotherhood members killed and supporters killed during those events than even those from the opposition, and yet no one is looking into who killed them and whether they should be adjudicated as well. And of course, as a result, we know that this is a highly, deeply politicized case, and that none of these charges, whether they could in some other context be considered legitimate or not, are clearly not legitimate in this context, because this is more about trying to settle political scores and trying to create a new political reality that takes away the process that was in place. And again, the imperfections of the process notwithstanding, the personalities involved notwithstanding, whether Morsi himself was a president who fulfilled the demands of the revolution notwithstanding, I think the process that was in place was certainly something that was supposed to endure. And I think, unfortunately, that the protests that came in this past summer were ones that took Egypt off of that track and put it on a track that will lead certainly to authoritarianism, because we're not seeing any other alternative from the Sisi presidency. And I think this is where it becomes dangerous to start comparing crowds and mobs and who can get the biggest crowd in the street. Yes, democratic processes can be quite imperfect, but unfortunately, we have no other measure of who supported the Constitution beyond the fact that over 2/3 of the Egyptian people who came out and voted for it voted in support, and there were millions of people. Was it a perfect document? Absolutely not. Were there problems in terms of the way that even the parliament had been elected, and the fact that there was no parliament that necessitated Morsi to basically take it upon himself to kind of take on processes that should have been delegated to a parliament? But he would be the first to say that he was trying to install a parliament at a time when, of course, the Mubarak era judiciary was not having it. And I think these are some of the bigger problems that I think have to be addressed and resolved.
Sarah, you referred to a little while ago the sort of the political backdrop, and considering what Abdullah Al Arian is saying, do you think this trial is politicized, as some people say that it is, and it's really between the Muslim Brotherhood as well as the government?
Yes, of course it's politicized, but again, I want to bring us to actual empirical reality of what's going on in Egypt, which is that President Morsi is not the president. President Morsi will not be reinstated, and the vast majority of the Egyptian people have made it very clear that that is not what they want. So this idea that somehow President Morsi was not in control and that the security services were in control, that's probably because he filled his cabinet with Mubarak-era former leaders, and the reason for that is what we saw during Morsi's presidency, and what we're now kind of diagnosing in retrospect, is that it was a leadership that was there for the sake of its own power and not really to fulfill the demands of the revolution. They won the presidential elections by 1.3% of the vote against an opponent who was a member of the old regime. Many people who considered themselves in the revolutionary camp voted for President Morsi for the sole reason that this president respect the revolution and do what he could to maintain the desires of the revolution. Egyptians found that that was very much not the case once President Morsi's regime was underway. He actually, in fact, collaborated with the military, and I understand you have to collaborate and work with the structures of the deep state.
How did he collaborate and then they ousted him?
Well, exactly. That you've just made my point, which is that he in fact excuse me, please don't interrupt. You've just made my point. He actually appointed Sisi, as we all know, and the reason why there was a coup is because of it followed mass popular revolts. Now, Abdullah Al Arian called it mobs, and so it's, you know, I was in Egypt at the time. It was a massive popular revolt, and the country was on the brink. I mean, I'm speaking here in terms of empirical reality. The country was on the brink of civil war.
The other
you had
massive
millions of
popular
people on the
revolt for
street
the last
who
4
were,
months.
excuse me,
You have
had
to
millions
acknowledge
of
the other
people on the
people who were
street who were
protesting in the
calling
street.
explicitly, excuse me, please do not interrupt. You will have your chance to speak.
Go ahead, Sarah. Go
you
ahead.
had millions of people. Thank you. You had millions of people on the streets in Egypt. The country was on the brink of civil war, and they explicitly called for the army to come in and broker a transition to military rule. I mean, people knew what they were doing.
Right.
Now, is this an authoritarian situation we're in now? Yes. Is this a politicized trial? Yes, absolutely. And my view on the situation is that you actually have two major players in Egypt, the old regime and the military, and the Muslim Brotherhood, both of whom are really fighting only for their own interests, both of whom have been involved in a dance with each other for decades in Egypt, both of whom do not have the best interests of the revolution at heart. And both of whom are really kind of wasting the time and energy of Egyptians by continuing this story, when really we need to be working on empowering civil society, building the economy, moving toward civilian rule that Egyptians actually want.
All right. Now, Abdullah Al-Haddad, please go ahead.
Well, the first point, speaking of this military Muslim Brotherhood thing, we have seen all the Sisi leaks in the past month, and Sisi said by himself that they will never accept any civilian rule Egypt and rule the military. They will never accept that, whether he is from the Islamists, whether he is a secular, whether he is a liberalist. They will never accept this idea. The military consider themselves as a different part of Egypt. They have 40% of the Egyptian economics. Now we have to rise again. Now we have to get back to our 25th of January revolution principles. Now we have seen Egypt is driven into a dark tunnel. They are establishing another state of tyranny, another state of dictatorship. Everyone is just speaking for himself. We have to admit that there is a political polarization between us, and the only way to sustain it is by the democratic process and the ballot box. This is the only way. If you don't like a certain political party, exclude him by the election. Don't exclude him by saying, I represent the majority of the Egyptian people. Don't exclude him by showing pictures of how much and how popular there was a protest on the street. This is not the right way. This is not Egypt we want.
Right.
The second point, it's not about Morsi as... Yeah, it's not about Morsi. It's about the principles we fought for. And we will keep on protesting, peacefully civil resistant to this military junta till we remove this military coup led by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and they being held for the crimes against humanity they have committed. Thousands and thousands of people were killed in the past 4 months. Thousands and thousands were arrested. Women, children, men, tortured.
Well,
we have seen everything that a dictator do.
Okay,
we
we'll have
should
to leave
not
it there.
accept that.
We're unfortunately veering off topic, but we'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks very much to my guests, Abdullah El-Haddad, Sarah Eltantawi, and Abdullah Al Arian for joining us on Inside Story. And thanks very much for the viewers for watching this edition. If you want to send your feedback, you can always do so. You can email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.